Welcome to Family Revenge Betrayal. Stay tuned, have a fun time, and let's talk in the comments. Let's go.
At my dad's funeral, my brother grinned and announced he'd sell our family home to cover gambling debts, and then my mother nodded like it was normal. 40 relatives watched me get erased. But the attorney was holding a sealed file Dad hid for 15 years. What would you do? If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type interested in the comments. And I will give you a heart. I'm Tessa Hart, and I'm starting with the moment my throat closed up because everything that came before it is just the slow buildup people use to justify the blow. 3 weeks ago, at my father's funeral outside Philadelphia, my brother Evan waited until the room was quiet, the last amen still hanging in the air, and announced to 40 people, "We're selling the family home on Maple Ridge to pay off debts. Mom can't handle it alone." And then my mother, Diane, nodded and added, "Sweet as poison. Your dad would understand. Your sister can find another place." I stood there while relatives avoided my eyes like they were afraid my pain might be contagious, and I felt that specific kind of humiliation you only get when someone rewrites your role in the family right in front of an audience, and everyone silently agrees. They didn't know what I knew, though. Or more accurately, they didn't know what my father had hidden for 15 years, and what I was about to find out would make that little funeral announcement look less like a decision and more like a crime in progress. Let me rewind to the call that started the dominoes. It was 2:07 a.m. when Mom called and said, "Your father collapsed. Jefferson Memorial. Come now." I threw on a coat, drove through highways, and when I pulled into the lot, Evan's Mercedes was there. He'd beaten me there. Of course he had. Evan has always arrived early when there's something to gain, and late when there's something to do. Inside the ICU, the air smelled like disinfectant and fear, and the nurse's voice was soft in that practiced way people use when they're trying not to make it worse. Dad was gone. No dramatic last words. No movie moment where he grabs your hand and says the truth he's been holding back. Just a sheet pulled up, a monitor silenced, and my mother's mascara running in thin black lines that made her look like a stranger. The last time I spoke to my father was 3 months earlier, a 90-second phone call with a long silence in the middle where we both tried to find the right words and came up empty. He asked, "You okay?" And I said, "Yeah." And that was basically our relationship in one sentence. Him checking in, me pretending it didn't hurt, and neither of us saying what needed to be said. To understand why that announcement hit like a punch, here's the short version. In our house, Evan was the future and I was the fine. When I asked for college help at 18, Mom said a husband would provide someday. Evan got checks, a car, and praise. I got scholarships, late shifts, and the quiet skill of swallowing disappointment. The morning after Dad died, I drove back to the house I grew up in for the first time in 3 years. Maple Ridge wasn't some humble starter home. It was a big colonial on a clean street, the kind of place that looks like stability even if the people inside are cracking. I pulled up, and Evan was already at the door, leaning like he lived there, giving me a quick one-armed hug that felt more like a receipt than comfort. "Long time," he said, and then his eyes did this quick scan of me like he was checking whether I looked weak enough to control. I walked in and immediately noticed the expensive clutter. Designer luggage stacked in the hallway, glossy shoe boxes by the stairs, a watch case on the console table that looked like it belonged in a jewelry store, not a grieving house. Evan had been between jobs for months, according to Mom, but his stuff told a different story, and it made my skin crawl, because I've learned the hard way that lies have a smell, and his smelled like fresh leather and desperation. I carried my overnight bag upstairs to what used to be my room, and I stopped in the doorway because it wasn't my room anymore. My bed was gone. My dresser was gone. In their place were piles of Evan's things like my childhood had been boxed up and shoved out of the way to make space for the golden child's overflow. It was such a perfect summary of our family dynamic that it almost made me laugh. Except it was that tight laugh you do when crying would make you look unstable, and unstable people get ignored. Downstairs, Mom was on the phone with the funeral home, voice calm, confident, almost relieved to have a role where people praised her again. "I've got everything under control," she kept saying, and I recognized that tone. It's the tone she uses when she wants everyone to believe she's the victim and the manager at the same time. I offered to help, and she assigned me the work nobody wanted. The calls, the obituary, the logistics, the relatives I hadn't spoken to in years who had immediately judged me for not calling more. Evan handled the sympathy. When neighbors stopped by with casseroles, he appeared like a politician, hand on his shoulder, voice thick. "Thank you so much, it means a lot." The same performance he'd done his whole life. Behind closed doors, though, I started catching fragments of conversations that stopped when I entered a room. It was always the same pattern. Hushed voices in the living room, the click of a phone screen going dark, Mom's face turning blank like she'd never been speaking. On the third night, I heard Evan in the kitchen on a call, voice tight. "Just give me until after this week, okay? I'll have it." Then he saw me and hung up so fast it was almost funny. "Who was that?" I asked. "Nobody," he said. "Work stuff." He hadn't worked in months. I didn't argue because arguing with Evan is like arguing with smoke. It just shifts and makes you cough, and he loves watching you choke. That night I lay in the guest room staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle, and I kept thinking about the size of Evan's fear. It wasn't grief. It was pressure. And pressure doesn't come from nowhere. Quick pause. "Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it?" Because I want you to stay with me, and I also want you to tell me straight in the comments. Did my mother cross the line at the funeral, or do you think family is family no matter what? Now, the night before the funeral, I couldn't sleep, so I did what I've always done when my life feels out of control. I organized. My dad had a small office in the basement with an old wooden desk and filing cabinets from the 90s, the kind that stick when you pull them too hard. Nobody had touched it since he got sick. I flipped on the light, and the room looked exactly like my father's mind. Cluttered, practical, a little dusty, full of things he meant to handle later. The first drawer was taxes and utility bills. The second drawer was old photos, report cards, and a folder labeled important in block letters. Inside were the basics: birth certificates, insurance documents, a couple of deeds. And then I found a single sheet of paper with a logo I didn't recognize. Hawthorne Family Holdings LLC, dated 2009. My stomach turned because my name was on it, and not just typed. My signature was at the bottom, loopy and young, the signature of a 23-year-old who trusted her father enough to sign where he pointed without reading the fine print. Suddenly, I remembered that day like it was a flash of film. Dad calling me home, saying, "Just some paperwork, nothing big," sliding a page across the table, tapping the line, smiling in that small, tired way of his, and me signing because I wanted, for once, to be the daughter he didn't have to fight with. I stood there in the basement holding that page like it was a live wire. I slipped it into my purse. The next morning, I tested the waters. "Mom," I said, casual like it didn't matter, "did Dad have a company called Hawthorne Family Holdings?" Her hand froze for half a second on her coffee mug. "That dissolved years ago," she said too quickly. "Don't waste your time digging through the past." Then she changed the subject, and that's when I knew it mattered. The funeral itself was gray and cold, the kind of day that makes everything feel heavier. Evan wore a suit that looked too expensive for someone who supposedly had no money, and he delivered a eulogy that had people dabbing their eyes. He talked about Dad like they were best friends, like Dad had been his mentor, his anchor, his hero. I sat in the back row listening to stories that didn't match the house I grew up in, and I kept thinking, if lying was a job, Evan would be rich, and apparently he was. After the final prayer, most people started gathering coats, but Evan stepped back up to the front like he'd been waiting for the real moment. "Just one more thing," he said, and the room hushed. Mom nodded at him like a director cueing an actor. That's when he announced the sale, and Mom did her little add-on about me being strong and independent and therefore disposable. People nodded along because it's easier to side with the person who looks confident than the person who looks shocked. Outside, I watched through a window as Evan shook hands with a man in a tailored gray suit and accepted a folder with a real estate logo on it. He brought a realtor to my father's funeral. I'm saying that again because it still makes my jaw tighten. He brought a realtor to my father's funeral. That night back at the house, I confronted them in the living room. Mom sat in Dad's chair like she'd inherited it already. Evan sprawled on the couch like he owned the whole world. "You said I agreed." I told Mom. "I didn't." Evan laughed. "Tess, you haven't been part of this family in years," he said, like he was doing me a favor by explaining reality. "What do you care?" Mom's face hardened. "You walked away," she said. "You weren't here when he was sick." Then Evan leaned forward and dropped his real threat, quiet enough to feel intimate. "Sign whatever paperwork we put in front of you, or I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of daughter you've been." And there it was, the family's favorite weapon. Public shame, served cold, with a smile. I didn't sleep. I drove back to my apartment the next day with that LLC paper burning a hole in my purse, and I realized something that made my hands shake on the steering wheel. They weren't selling a house. They were trying to erase me legally, emotionally, publicly, all at once. And if my father really set something up in 2009, if my signature is on it, then this story isn't just about grief or favoritism or family drama. It's about ownership, control, and a plan that somebody thought would stay buried. I sat in my dark apartment that night, pulled up the funeral program, and stared at the name of my father's estate attorney printed in small text like an afterthought. Then I picked up my phone, and with my heart pounding like I was about to step into traffic, I made the call that was going to turn my mother's smug nod into a very different kind of silence. My finger I didn't call the attorney like some calm, put-together adult who has everything figured out. I called him like a woman who just watched her own mother nod along to the theft of her childhood in public and then pretend it was for the family. And my hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. And when the receptionist answered, I heard myself say, "My name is Tessa Hart, Richard Hart's daughter. He passed away, and I need to speak to Mr. Calder today, and I don't know if it was my voice or the word passed away, but she stopped sounding bored immediately. And then she put me on hold, and that hold music felt like it was mocking me because my whole life my family has treated me like background noise, and now I'm begging a stranger for 5 minutes of attention. Mr. Calder came on with that measured lawyer voice, the kind that makes you feel like you're about to be billed for breathing, and he said, "Miss Hart, I'm sorry for your loss." And I almost laughed because my own mother didn't say that to me, not once. She just assigned me tasks and called it coping, and I said, "I found a paper in my father's basement office, Hawthorne Family Holdings LLC, dated 2009, and my signature is on it, and my mother says it dissolved, and my brother is trying to sell the house." And there was a pause, not a confused pause, a pause like he was choosing words carefully, and then he said, "Can you come in today?" And I said yes, and then he said, "Bring that document, and do not sign anything your family gives you until we talk." And that right there made my stomach drop because it told me one thing clearly. They were going to try. I drove downtown with my mind racing, and I kept replaying my mother's voice at the funeral. "Your sister can find another place," like I was a tenant who missed rent instead of a daughter who lost her father. And I kept thinking about how families treat love like a contract until you ask them to honor it. And then suddenly the fine print appears, and I could already see it coming, the guilt, the "after all we've done," the "your father would want," the whole performance. Mr. Calder's office was in one of those older buildings with brass plaques and carpet that smells like money, And when I sat down across from him, he looked tired in a way that told me he'd seen families do ugly things before lunch plenty of times. And he slid a legal pad in front of him and said, "Tell me exactly what happened at the funeral." And I did. I told him how Evan announced the sale like a victory speech. And then my mother made me sound like I was lucky to be dismissed. And then I told him about the realtor, and I watched his jaw tighten just slightly, and then he asked, "Do you know why they're selling?" And I said, "My brother is in trouble. I don't know how deep, but I heard him on the phone begging for time." And then I pulled the LLC paper from my purse like it was a grenade and slid it across the desk. He didn't skim it like a normal person, he studied it like it mattered, and then he said, "This is not nothing." And I felt my whole body lean forward like my spine finally remembered it had a job. And then he asked me, "Do you recall signing this?" And I said yes. That day in 2009, Dad called me home and said it was administrative, and I signed because I wanted to be trusted. And then Mr. Calder nodded slowly and said, "That would have made you 23. And I said yes, and then he said, "And you never received annual statements, notices, tax documents, anything?" And I said no. And then he said, "Your father handled it quietly." And I told him my mother said it dissolved, and he gave me a look that was half pity and half warning and said, "Your mother is either misinformed or lying." And then he opened a file drawer and pulled out a thick folder with my father's name on the tab like it had been waiting for me. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't do the big reveal like a movie. He just turned the folder toward me and started laying things out piece by piece. And as he did, it felt like my life was being relabeled in real time. In 2009, he said, "Your father transferred the Maple Ridge property into Hawthorne Family Holdings LLC." And I blinked like my brain refused to accept the words, and he kept going. "The deed transfer was recorded. The LLC has been kept active. Fees paid. Filings maintained." And then he tapped a line on the operating agreement and said, "The sole member listed here is you." And I swear to you my lungs stopped working for a second, because there's a special kind of shock when you realize you've been walking around powerless only because nobody told you had a key. I said, "That can't be right, because that's what people say when the truth finally arrives and it doesn't match the story they've been forced to live." And then he said, calm as steel, "It's right." And then he looked me dead in the eyes and added, "And your brother cannot sell a property he does not own." And my first thought wasn't even relief, it was fury. Because if this was true, then my mother stood in a funeral home and told 40 people I could find another place while plotting to sell a house that legally wasn't hers to sell. And that isn't grief, that's calculation. I asked him why Dad would hide it, and Mr. Calder didn't romanticize my father. He just said, "Your father anticipated what would happen when he was gone." And then he asked, "Has your brother ever had gambling issues?" And I hesitated and said, "He's always had money issues." And he nodded like that was enough. And then he said, "Your father likely used you as the protective barrier." And those words hit me because they were both comforting and heartbreaking. Comforting because it meant Dad did something, heartbreaking because it meant he didn't believe my mother would protect me even after he died. Then Mr. Calder said, "There's going to be backlash." And I laughed this short, bitter laugh because backlash is my family's native language. And then he said, "They will try to pressure you to sign a disclaimer or a quitclaim or an acknowledgement that you have no interest." And I felt cold because it matched exactly what my gut was screaming. He told me the next move would depend on what they did next. And then he said, "But you need to be strategic because people like your brother don't panic unless they're cornered." And then he leaned forward and said, "Do you want to confront them privately, or do you want the truth to come out the way the lie did in front of witnesses?" And I sat there thinking about the funeral room, about those 40 faces, about the way shame becomes a leash when everyone watches you wearing it. And I said, "I want it on record, because if they were going to make me the villain publicly, then they could meet the paperwork publicly too." I left his office with copies, instructions, and the kind of clarity that makes you feel dangerous. And as I walked to my car, my phone buzzed and buzzed and buzzed. And when I looked down, it was my mother calling, and then Evan, and then my mother again. And then Evan again, like they suddenly remembered I existed the second I might stop cooperating. I didn't answer. I drove straight to the house, and when I pulled into the driveway, Evan's Mercedes was there, and then I noticed something that made my stomach flip. A manila envelope on the kitchen counter with a pen sitting on top like a little command, and Mom was standing at the sink with her back rigid, and Evan was at the table scrolling his phone like he was waiting for a delivery. "There you are," Mom said without turning fully, and her tone was sweet but sharp, the tone that says behave, and Evan patted the chair beside him like he was training a dog. "We need to wrap this up today," he said, and then he pushed the envelope toward me, and I didn't even sit down, I just stared at the header and felt my hands clench because the title might as well have said "Sign yourself out of the family." "What is this?" I asked, and Mom said, "It's just paperwork so we can move forward without complications," and Evan added, "It's for your own good," which is always what people say when they're about to rob you politely. I picked up the pages and scanned the first paragraph and saw the phrase "disclaimer of interest," and I looked up and said, "Why would I sign away something I don't have?" And Evan's face tightened for half a second, just long enough to tell me I'd hit the nerve, and then he smiled again, too fast, and said, "Because we don't need you coming back later trying to claim the house." And Mom chimed in, "Your father would want us to keep this simple." And that's when I realized what they were doing. They were trying to build the story that I was the greedy one, the difficult one, the daughter who shows up late and asks for money. Because if you control the narrative, you can control the crowd. I set the papers down and said, "I'm not signing anything today." And Evan's chair scraped back as he stood, and his voice dropped low. "Tess, don't do this." And Mom finally turned fully and looked at me with those hard eyes, and she said, "If you embarrass this family, I will tell everyone exactly how you've behaved for years." And I almost smiled because there it was, the weapon again, public shame. And then Evan stepped closer and hissed, "And if you stall, you're putting all of us at risk." And I said, "At risk from what?" And his mouth opened and closed like he'd said too much. And then Mom answered for him, quiet and shaky, "He owes people." And then she swallowed and added, "People who don't wait." And right then, in my mother's voice, I heard something I hadn't heard before. Not love, not concern for me, but fear, real fear. And it confirmed what my gut already knew. This wasn't just about selling a house. This was about paying a debt they were terrified to name, and they were ready to sacrifice me to do it. So I did the one thing they never expect from the daughter they've trained to fold. I looked Evan dead in the face and said, "Tell me the number." And he stared back at me with rage and panic flickering behind his eyes, and he said, "You don't want to know." And I said, "Try me." And then he finally spit it out, low and fast, like the words tasted like blood, and the number he said made my knees go weak. Because it wasn't some small mistake you can patch with a quick sale. It was a hole deep, enough to swallow the entire family. And the worst part was I could already see what they were going to do next, because the moment I didn't sign, their plan didn't change, it escalated. The number Evan spit out didn't land like information. It landed like a threat, like someone had leaned in and whispered the exact price of your safety, and for a second I just stared at him, because you can't process that kind of debt in a normal kitchen with normal light. You can't hear a number like that with your mother standing there clutching the counter and pretend this is just estate planning. And my mother's face had gone gray around the mouth like she'd been holding her breath for weeks, and she finally said, "We can't handle this alone." Like she was confessing to a crime, and Evan snapped, "Stop looking at me like I'm a monster. Tess, I'm trying to fix it." And I wanted to laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was the kind of delusion you only get when you've been protected your whole life, the belief that destruction counts as effort if you do it with confidence. I didn't even raise my voice. I kept it low, controlled, because I've learned that in families like mine, the second you get emotional, they use it as proof you're unstable. So I said, "You're not fixing it, you're passing it." And he flinched, and Mom cut in fast. "Tessa, please, not like this." And I looked at her and said, "Not like this?" You announced at Dad's funeral that I could find another place, and you nodded along like you were approving a menu. And her eyes flashed with that old anger, the anger she uses to cover guilt, and she said, "You weren't here." And I said, "I'm here now," and Evan scoffed. "Yeah, now that there's something to take." And that's when I felt something in me go ice cold, because he was still trying to sell the story that I was the opportunist, when the only reason he knew the word opportunist was because he'd lived as one. I picked up the disclaimer papers again and held them up between us like evidence, and I asked, "If I have no claim, why are you both so desperate for my signature?" And Mom's mouth tightened, and she didn't answer, and Evan's eyes darted away, and that told me everything, because silence is a confession when the question is simple. I set the papers down gently, like I was setting down a plate, and I said, "I met with Mr. Calder." And the air in that kitchen changed instantly. Evan's head snapped up, Mom's shoulders stiffened, and Evan said, "Why would you do that?" In this disgusted tone, like I'd called the police on the family dog, and I said, "Because you tried to bully me into giving up my rights in front of 15 relatives and a casserole tray." And Mom hissed, "We were trying to protect you." And I almost lost it. Right there, because that is the dirtiest sentence a parent can say. The one where they paint their betrayal as a favor. And I said, "No, you were trying to protect Evan." And Evan slammed his palm on the table hard enough to rattle the pen, and he said, "I'm your brother." And I said, "Then act like it." And he stared at me with this raw panic behind his anger, and he said, "They've been following me." And the way he said they made my stomach twist, because it wasn't just bookies calling his phone. It sounded like real fear, the kind you don't fake for sympathy when you're still in designer shoes. Mom started talking fast, like if she kept the words moving, she wouldn't have to feel them. 2 weeks ago, someone left a note on his windshield. Last week, his tires were cut, and he's been getting calls at night, and your father didn't know how bad it got. And I said, "Dad knew enough to protect the house." And she snapped, "Don't twist this into him loving you more." And I said, "It's not love more, it's trust more." And that hit her like a slap, because parents like my mother don't want the truth. They want the hierarchy to remain intact even after death. Evan leaned in and lowered his voice like he was negotiating. "Tess, if you sign that, we can sell, we can pay them, and then we'll rebuild. We'll split what's left. Mom can move somewhere smaller, you'll be fine. You always land on your feet." And there it was again, that wordless assumption that my life is endlessly adjustable because they've never respected it, like I'm a spare tire you toss in the trunk until you need it. I stared at him and said, "You want me to sign away the one thing Dad quietly protected, so you can throw it into the same fire you've been feeding for years?" And he opened his mouth to argue. But Mom stepped closer, and her voice went soft, dangerously soft. "What do you want, Tessa?" And I said, "I want the truth." And she said, "This is the truth." And I said, "No, this is the part of the truth you can't hide anymore." And then I asked the question I'd been avoiding since the funeral because it felt too cruel. "Did Dad leave a letter for me?" And Mom blinked fast, and Evan's face tightened, and Mom said, "He left instructions." And that was the moment I knew there was something else. Something they either hadn't opened yet or had opened and were sitting on. And my heart started pounding, because if Dad had planned for this, then there were more pieces on the board. I went upstairs without asking permission, because I'm done asking permission in my own family, and I walked into Dad's old study and felt that familiar smell of paper and cedar and his aftershave faint in the air, and on his desk was a stack of folders neatly aligned like he'd been trying to hold order in a house full of chaos. And I could hear my mother downstairs calling my name like I was a teenager sneaking out, and Evan's heavier footsteps following, and I opened the top drawer, and there it was, a sealed envelope with my name on it in my father's handwriting. The same handwriting I used to see on lunch notes when I was little, messy and rushed, but unmistakably his. And my hand shook as I held it, because you don't realize how starved you are for a parent's attention until it's packaged in paper and sealed away like contraband. Evan appeared in the doorway and his voice sharpened. "Don't touch that." And I looked at him and said, "You don't get to tell me what I can touch in my father's office." And Mom pushed past him and saw the envelope and froze, and she whispered, "He wrote you one." Like she couldn't believe it, like it offended her that my father had a private thought for me. And for a second I saw something like grief on her face. Real grief, not performance grief. And then it hardened into resentment. And she said, "He never wrote me letters." And I almost said, "Maybe that tells you something," but I held it back because I wasn't here to win an argument. I was here to stop a robbery. I tore the envelope open carefully, and inside was one page. Just one. But my father's words felt heavier than the whole house. He wrote that he was sorry he didn't defend me out loud, that he saw what was happening for years, that he didn't know how to confront it without tearing the family apart, and that he chose the only way he could: paperwork, protection, something that couldn't be shouted down or guilted out of existence. He wrote that Evan's problem wasn't bad luck, it was addiction, and that my mother's loyalty would turn into enabling if no one stopped it, and he asked me to be the stop. Then there was a line that made my throat close. "If you're reading this, it means they tried to make you smaller again, and I'm sorry I wasn't there to stand in front of you, so I built something that could." I read it once, twice, and my mother kept whispering, "Let me see," like she was entitled to it, and Evan kept saying, "This doesn't change anything," but his voice was shaking now, and I knew he was scared, not of me, of losing the escape route he'd already sold himself in his mind. I folded the letter and put it in my pocket, and Mom reached for my arm, and I stepped back and she said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I'm going to do what Dad asked." And Evan sneered, "You mean punish me?" And I said, "No, I mean stop you." And I watched his jaw clench, and he whispered, "You don't understand what happens if we don't pay." And I said, "Then we do this the right way." And Mom's voice rose. "There is no right way, there is only before they show up and after they show up." And that sentence right there told me this had gone beyond money. It had entered danger. I pulled my phone out and texted Mr. Calder one sentence. "They're pressuring me to sign tonight, and they claim threats. What do I do now?" His reply came fast. "Do not sign, leave the house. We move tomorrow with witnesses." And then, like the universe wanted to prove him right immediately, Evan's phone buzzed on the desk, and he looked at the screen and went pale, and Mom's eyes widened and she whispered, "Who is it?" And Evan swallowed and said, "It's them." And I didn't even have time to ask what them meant this time because a car door slammed outside. Heavy, deliberate. And then there was a knock on the front door that didn't sound like a neighbor, and didn't sound like family, and didn't sound like sympathy. It sounded like collection. The knock hit the front door like whoever was on the other side didn't believe in manners, only outcomes, and my mother's face did that strange thing where the skin tightens before the fear shows. And Evan didn't move at first. He just stared at his phone like it had betrayed him, and then he whispered, "Don't open it." Like we had any choice, because the second knock came immediately after, harder, and then a man's voice carried through the wood, calm and loud enough to be heard. "Evan. Henderson, we need to talk." And I felt my stomach drop because it wasn't a random guess, it was a name, and when someone says your name from outside a locked door, that's not a conversation request, that's proof they've been watching. My mother grabbed my wrist, nails digging in, and hissed, "Go upstairs." And I pulled free and said, "No, I'm not leaving you two to handle this the way you handle everything, with panic and lies." And Evan finally moved, pacing like an animal in a cage, and I could see his hands shaking, not the dramatic shaking people do when they want sympathy, the real kind, the kind that comes from adrenaline and dread. The voice outside came again, still polite, which somehow made it worse. "We're not here to cause a scene, Mrs. Henderson. We just need a word." And my mother flinched because they knew her too, and she whispered, "How do they know my name?" And Evan snapped, "Because I told them everything, okay? I told them what I had to tell them." And that sentence made my blood run cold, because when a gambler starts telling them everything, it means he's been trading other people's safety for time. I stepped toward the door, not to open it, but to control the moment, and I said through the wood, loud and steady, "This is a private residence, you need to leave." And there was a pause, and then the man outside chuckled like I'd said something cute, and he replied, "Ma'am, we can do this calmly, or we can do this with paperwork, but we are not leaving empty-handed." And then I heard another sound, not words, just a small tap against the doorframe, like someone flicking a ring or a coin. A nervous habit, and that detail made the whole thing feel real in my bones. Evan's breathing turned fast, and my mother's eyes darted to the window, and I could tell she was calculating whether she could run. And that's when it hit me. This was the moment Dad was trying to prevent, not because he wanted to punish anyone, but because he knew once fear enters a home, people stop thinking and start surrendering. I turned to Evan and kept my voice low. "How much time did you buy with this?" And he swallowed hard and said, 2 days. And my mother gasped like he'd admitted to an affair, and I said, 2 days is not a plan, it's a countdown. And he shouted back, "Then what do you want me to do, Tess? Just let them ruin me?" And I said, "You already did that. The question is whether you ruin everyone else with you." And my mother stepped between us like she could physically block the truth. "Stop, both of you, stop." And then, because timing loves cruelty, the doorknob jiggled, not forced, not broken, just tested, and the man outside said pleasantly, "We can see the lights, folks. No need for games." And I watched Evan's shoulders sag, and in that sag, I saw the core of addiction, the exhaustion of someone who has been running from consequences so long he can't imagine standing still. I pulled my phone out and called Mr. Calder, speaker on, no hesitation, and when he answered, I didn't dress it up. I said, "Someone claiming to be a creditor is at the house right now, asking for Evan by name." And my mother tried to wave me off like I was embarrassing her, but I held my ground because embarrassment is cheaper than danger. Mr. Calder's voice came through crisp and controlled. "Do not open the door. Do not speak further. If they refuse to leave, call local police, and Brianna, get yourself out of that house tonight." And Evan barked, "Who is that?" And I said, "The attorney you should have called before you gambled away your spine." And the voice outside must have heard the word attorney, because he laughed again and said, "Lawyer won't change what's owed." And Mr. Calder's tone sharpened. "Ma'am, stop engaging, hang up, call authorities if needed." And I did, because I wasn't going to negotiate at my father's door like this was a flea market for dignity. My mother's hands were trembling, and she said, "This is your fault," automatically, because blaming me is her default setting, but her voice cracked at the end because she didn't believe it, not fully, and I said, "No, this is the bill for the choices you've been covering." And she flinched again, and Evan suddenly moved toward the back of the house like he might bolt, and I said, "Evan, stop." And he whipped around, eyes wild. "They'll hurt me." And I said, "Then you tell the truth and you get help, because if you keep hiding, you're going to keep dragging strangers to our family's doorstep." And I watched him fight with himself for a split second, and then he did something I did not expect. He sank onto the stairs and put his head in his hands and said, "I can't stop," like a confession he'd been holding in his throat for years. And here's where I want you to tell me something, because I know exactly what the comment section is thinking right now. Some of you are going to say, "Protect the brother, family is family." And some of you are going to say, "Throw him out, let him learn." So I want to ask you directly, if you were me, would you protect him from consequences or protect the home from him? And why? Because that one question splits families right down the middle and exposes who's been enabled and who's been sacrificed. The knocking stopped, and for a moment there was silence, and I realized they were waiting, listening, deciding whether fear would do the work for them. And my mother finally did something motherly for the first time in a long time. She whispered, "Evan, please." And he looked up, eyes wet, and said, "I didn't mean for Dad to die before I fixed it." And my mother's face crumpled because grief and guilt are cousins. And then her expression hardened again because she can't sit in softness for long, and she turned to me and said, "So what now? You're going to take the house and leave us to deal with this?" And I shook my head. "No, I'm going to take the house and stop the bleeding." And she scoffed. "How?" And I said, "Tomorrow, there's a formal reading, and every relative you used as an audience to humiliate me is going to hear exactly what Dad did and why." And Evan jolted. "You're going to air this out?" And I said, "You already aired it out at the funeral. I'm just correcting the broadcast." And my mother whispered, "You can't do that to me." And I said, "You did it to me for years. The difference is I'm not lying." The voice outside returned, quieter now, like he'd moved closer, and he said, "Last chance tonight, folks. We can make this easy." And I felt anger rise, clean and hot, the kind that gives you steadiness instead of chaos. And I walked to the curtain and peered through a sliver without exposing myself. And I saw a dark sedan parked too close to the curb, headlights off, and one man on the porch, another leaning against the car like he owned the street. And in that moment, I understood why Dad used paperwork, because paper is the only thing these people respect. I stepped back, heart pounding, and I said, "We're leaving through the back." And my mother grabbed her purse. Evan stood up too fast, and as we moved, I could hear the porch boards creak, like the man had shifted his weight. And then the front door handle turned again, not forced, just tested, and he said softly, "Don't make this difficult." And we slipped out the back into the cold night air, and my mother's breath came out in little clouds. And Evan looked like he might vomit, and I didn't even wait for them to complain. I got them into my car because control is the only currency you can spend in a moment like this. I drove without turning the radio on, just the sound of tires on pavement, and my mother whispering prayers she didn't usually believe in, and Evan staring at his hands like they were foreign. And I took them to a hotel off the highway. Nothing fancy, just bright lights and cameras and a lobby that smelled like coffee and bleach. And when the clerk asked for ID, my mother looked embarrassed. And I almost laughed because now she knew what it felt like to be displaced by someone else's choices. In the room, Evan sat on the edge of the bed and said, "If you tell everyone tomorrow, they'll hate me." And I said, "They already should." And then I softened just enough to keep him listening. But hate is not the goal. Stopping you is the goal. And my mother snapped, "Don't talk about him like he's an animal." And I looked at her and said, "Then stop feeding him like he is." And she went quiet. I called Mr. Calder again and told him what happened, and he said, "Good, stay put. Tomorrow we do this with witnesses and documents." And I hung up, and my mother stared at me and asked, "Are you enjoying this?" And I said, "No, I'm surviving it." And Evan finally said, barely audible, "I need help." And I nodded, "Yes, you do." And then my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, just one line. "We'll talk tomorrow, house or not." And my stomach dropped as I realized this wasn't only about the house anymore. It was about what Evan had promised them and what they thought they could still take. The next morning I woke up in that hotel room like I'd been running all night in my sleep, heart already sprinting before my feet hit the carpet. And the first thing I saw was my mother sitting upright in the armchair staring at the window blinds like she was waiting for someone to rappel down the glass. And Evan was on the bed still wearing yesterday's clothes, shoes on, like he'd been too afraid to fully commit to sleep. And my phone was face down on the nightstand where I'd left it, but I didn't need to flip it over to remember that text. "We'll talk tomorrow, house or not," because those words had glued themselves to the inside of my skull. I turned the phone over anyway, and there it was, unreadable number, no name, just that one sentence, and for a second my hands went cold because I realized something that should have been obvious earlier. The house wasn't the prize, the house was leverage, and leverage only matters if you plan to squeeze someone. My mother's voice was thin. "They're going to kill him," and Evan said, "Stop saying that." But his voice shook when he said it, and I said, "Nobody is dying today. Not if we stop acting like fear is a strategy." And my mother snapped, "Easy for you to say. You have a lawyer." And I looked right at her and said, "You've had 2 decades of chances to choose me, to choose the truth, to choose stability. And you chose denial because it was quieter, and now the bill is loud." Evan stood up too fast, paced the room, and then stopped like he'd hit an invisible wall. "What do I do if they show up at the lawyer's office?" And I said, "You don't go alone. You don't answer unknown calls. You don't play hero, and you tell the full truth today, because the half-truths are what got you followed." We drove to Mr. Calder's office early, and I picked a route with turns and extra lights because paranoia suddenly becomes practical when someone has already proven they can find your address. And I kept checking the rearview mirror for a dark sedan that looked too patient, and my mother clutched her purse like it contained oxygen. Mr. Calder's building looked exactly like the kind of place that keeps secrets alive: brass nameplate, heavy glass doors, lobby that smelled like furniture polish and old decisions. And when we got upstairs, he already had 2 people waiting in the conference room: Patricia Callahan, the accountant with that steady face that tells you she's seen every kind of family lie there is, and a notary whose job is basically to stare at signatures like they're crime scenes. Mr. Calder didn't waste time. "Before anyone else arrives, I need clarity," he said, eyes on Evan. "Who is texting you? And what exactly did you promise?" Evan's mouth opened and closed, and my mother jumped in. "He didn't promise anything. He was just trying to buy time." And Mr. Calder's stare didn't move. "Ma'am, buying time is promising something?" I asked him. And Evan finally spoke, voice low. "It started with sports betting. And then he swallowed. And then it turned into cards. And then it turned into loans." And Patricia didn't flinch. She just nodded like she'd been waiting for the confession to catch up to the evidence. And Evan said, "I told them the house was getting sold. I told them my mom would handle it. I told them there'd be money after the funeral." And my mother made a noise like she was choking. "I didn't know you told them that." And I said, "Yes, you did. You just didn't want to hear it." And Evan's eyes flicked to me, guilty, desperate. "I said you were the problem. I said you were trying to block it." And that one hit like a slap. Not because it was shocking, but because it was so on brand for this family too. Use me as the obstacle in every story, the villain in every convenient narrative. I inhaled slowly and said, "So the text wasn't a bluff." And Mr. Calder nodded. "It's pressure, and it will escalate if they think intimidation works." And then he looked at Evan. "Today you stop negotiating with criminals and start complying with reality." The door opened at exactly 10 on the like the universe enjoys punctual irony, and the rest of the family started filing in. Uncle Frank first, heavy footsteps, stern face, and Dorothy next with that expression that says she's already decided who's guilty and she's just here for the performance. Then 2 cousins who looked uncomfortable but curious. And finally my mother's sister, who never speaks unless she smells blood in the water. And then my mother rose a little, as if the presence of witnesses made her posture stronger, and Evan put on his "I'm fine" face that didn't match his trembling knee under the table. Mr. Calder introduced himself calmly, explained the purpose, and then did something that almost made me smile because it was so surgical. He said, "Before we proceed, I want to clarify a misstatement that was made publicly at the funeral." And you could see the room tighten because no one likes being told the script is being edited. And Aunt Dorothy said, "Misstatement." And Mr. Calder replied, "Yes." It was stated that the Maple Street home was being sold by the family to cover debts, and it was implied that all heirs were in agreement. Neither is accurate. My mother's cheeks flushed. We were doing what Richard would have wanted. And Mr. Calder didn't even blink. We are about to address what Richard actually did, which is more reliable than what anyone guesses he wanted. He slid a folder across the table, thick, clean, organized, and then he turned on the projector with a click that sounded like a judge's gavel, and the first document appeared, the LLC formation papers, and I watched my mother's eyes narrow like she was reading a foreign language she resented. Mr. Calder said, "In 2009, Richard transferred the Maple Street property into a limited liability company, properly filed, properly maintained, with annual reports and fees paid. The property is not part of his personal estate, and Evan snapped, "That's not possible." Forgetting for a second that his name wasn't the one on the documents, and Mr. Calder looked up. "It's not only possible, it's done." Aunt Dorothy leaned forward. "So, who owns the company?" And Mr. Calder paused just long enough for everyone to lean in, and then he said, "The sole member is Teresa Henderson," and my name landed in the room like a dropped plate, loud in the silence, and I saw 3 different reactions at once. Uncle Frank's eyebrows lift in surprise, Aunt Dorothy's face harden with instant accusation, and my mother's expression shift into something uglier than anger, betrayal mixed with panic, because her whole plan depended on me being powerless. She turned to me and hissed, "You knew?" And I said, "I found out after you tried to erase me in front of 40 people. And Aunt Dorothy jumped in. "Oh, please, you always hated this family." And I looked at her and said, "No, I hated being used by this family. There's a difference." Mr. Calder raised a hand. "The document trail is exhaustive, notarized, witnessed, filed, and corroborated by Patricia Callahan, who assisted with the original formation, and Patricia spoke for the first time, voice calm and factual. Richard formed it to protect the home from financial instability and coercion. He told me why, he told me who he trusted, and he did it while fully competent." My mother's throat bobbed as she swallowed. He didn't trust me. And it wasn't a question, it was disbelief, like the universe had broken a rule, and Mr. Calder said, "That is what the evidence indicates." And Evan slammed his palm lightly on the table, not strong enough to be threatening, just loud enough to be embarrassing. "This is crazy. We need the money." And that was the moment the room turned, because when someone says, "We need the money," at a will reading, everyone hears what it really means, and Uncle Frank said, "What money?" And my mother opened her mouth to lie, and then closed it, because lying was getting expensive. I leaned forward and said it clearly. "Evan owes around $340,000 in gambling debt," and you could feel the air change, like someone turned the oxygen down, and Aunt Dorothy gasped, 340, and one cousin whispered, "Are you kidding me?" And my mother said, voice cracking, "I was trying to keep him safe." And I replied, "You were trying to keep him comfortable, and comfort is not safety when the problem is addiction." Evan's face went red. "You had to tell them?" And I said, "You brought strangers to our door last night. This stopped being private when you made it dangerous." Mr. Calder tapped the table. "We are not here to litigate feelings. We are here to establish control of the asset and the boundaries around it." And then he turned to me, "Ms. Henderson, as sole member, you decide." And that sentence right there was the moment my entire childhood inverted, because for once the power wasn't floating above me like a chandelier I could admire but never touch. It was in my hands. I looked around the table, at faces that had judged me at the funeral, faces that had nodded when my mother said I could find another place, and I said, "Here is what's going to happen." And I kept my tone steady because rage is satisfying but clarity is lethal. My mother can remain in the home under a formal lease, $1 a month, renewed annually with conditions, and my mother's eyes widened. "Conditions?" And I said, "No more secret loans. No more signing anything without counsel. No more using the home as collateral. And Evan does not live there." And Evan started, "You can't." And I cut him off. "I can, and I am." And Dorothy scoffed. "So you're just going to throw your own brother away?" And I looked at her and said, "No, I'm going to stop paying his addiction in real estate." Evan's voice cracked. "They're going to hurt me," and Uncle Frank snapped. "Who are they?" And Evan didn't answer because shame loves silence, and my mother whispered, "We need time." And I said, "You already spent the time. You spent it pretending this wasn't happening." Mr. Calder slid another paper toward Evan. "If you want help, We can arrange treatment, and we can coordinate with law enforcement regarding threats, but you are done making promises on behalf of property you don't own." And Evan stared at the paper like it was written in fire. And then, because life apparently enjoys pushing the knife deeper when you finally stand up, my phone buzzed again, a known number. And this time it wasn't a sentence, it was a photo, grainy, taken from a distance, of my car parked outside this very building, and beneath it one word: outside. My stomach dropped so fast it felt like my body forgot how gravity works. And I didn't even realize I'd stood up until my chair legs scraped, and every head at that mahogany table snapped toward me like I'd pulled a fire alarm. And then Mr. Calder's calm voice cut through the room. "Don't move toward the window." Like he'd said it 100 times to panicked clients who think adrenaline equals intelligence. And my mother whispered, "What is it?" And Evan leaned forward, eyes wide. "Who is texting you?" And I said, "Someone just sent me a photo of my car from outside this building." And Aunt Dorothy actually laughed, this sharp little sound like she didn't believe danger was real unless it came with a headline, "Oh please, that's just a scare tactic." And then Mr. Calder did something that told me he wasn't guessing. He was operating. He reached under the table, hit a button on his desk phone, and said one sentence in a low, controlled tone. "Front desk, lock the lobby doors and call building security now." And then he looked at all of us and said, "Phone's down, no one responds, no one goes to the window, and if anyone here is thinking of stepping outside to talk it out, you are not brave, you are useful to whoever sent that message." Evan's face turned that sick gray color, the one people get when their lies finally grow teeth, and he muttered, "They found me." And my mother's lips started trembling, and I watched her reach for her pearls like they were prayer beads. "Now here's what I need you to do for me before I keep going. Because this is the moment where stories stop feeling like stories and start feeling like your own chest tightening. Drop a quick comment and tell me where you're watching from right now. And if you're comfortable, tell me if you've ever had a family member drag danger to your doorstep and then act surprised when it knocks." Mr. Calder slid his chair back slowly, no sudden movements, and then he said, "Ms. Henderson, show me the message." And I rotated my phone toward him, and his eyes narrowed, not fear, not shock, just assessment, like he was measuring the distance between threat and consequence. And then he said, "This is intimidation, and intimidation only works when it gets a response." And Uncle Frank, who'd been quiet, finally spoke, voice low and hard. "Evan, you brought this here." And Evan snapped, "I didn't bring them, they're everywhere." And then he rubbed his forehead and whispered, "I can't breathe." And in that split second I saw it. Not the charming brother who always landed on his feet, not the golden son, but the addict, the kind of desperation that eats the person from the inside and then uses everyone around them like oxygen tanks. My mother turned to me, eyes wet. "Teresa, please." And the word please sounded weird coming from her mouth, like a language she never bothered to learn until she needed something. And I said, "This is not a please moment. This is a truth moment." And Mr. Calder nodded once like he'd been waiting for that. He opened a folder and started speaking like a man laying tracks in front of a speeding train. "We are documenting everything, timestamps, screenshots, and we are creating a paper trail that makes it very expensive for anyone to keep playing games." And then he looked at Evan and said, "You're going to tell me exactly who they are, how you met them, how much you owe, and what you promised." And Evan tried to dodge. "It's complicated." And Mr. Calder said, "No, it's embarrassing, but it's not complicated." Evan swallowed and then finally said it. "It started online." And then he kept going like he couldn't stop once the door cracked. An app, bets, parleys, and then I lost, and then I chased, and then I found a guy who said he could float me until I hit a win streak, and then I signed something, and then I signed another thing, and then the interest started stacking like a bonfire, and then they said if I didn't pay they'd come to the house. And my mother made this sound like she'd been punched. You told me it was investments, and Evan snapped back, because you only respect investments. You don't respect addiction, you don't respect mess. You respect anything that sounds like a man in a suit. And the room went dead quiet, because that one landed on everyone, especially the women who defended him out loud for years. Mr. Calder leaned forward. Names, and Evan hesitated and then said, I don't know real names, I know numbers, I know nicknames, I know one guy they call Rico. And Uncle Frank said, Jesus. And Aunt Dorothy suddenly wasn't laughing anymore. And then my phone buzzed again, and every nerve in my body screamed not to look, but I looked anyway, and it was another message, we can wait. And then, like the sender wanted to prove they could touch us without touching us, another photo came through. This time the building entrance, the brass nameplate, and a hand in the frame holding a folded piece of paper like a note, and for a second I couldn't hear anything except my own pulse. Mr. Calder held out his hand. Give me your phone. And I did, and he turned to the projector and said, We're not whispering anymore. And then he projected the messages onto the screen for everyone to see. Because sometimes the fastest way to stop a family from gaslighting you is to put the truth in a size 72 font. My mother stared at the screen and whispered, What do they want? And I said, They want fear, and then they want money, and then they want more money, and then they want control. And Mr. Calder said, Correct. And then he added, And the best way to break that chain is to remove the asset they think they can reach. He turned to me. Ms. Henderson, you're going to authorize immediate steps to secure the property and remove access. And Aunt Dorothy scoffed, You can't just do that. And Mr. Calder shot her a look so cold it could frost glass. Watch me. He started listing actions like bullets, not suggestions. We file an emergency notice with the county that the property is held by an LLC and is not available for transfer by any other party. We notify the listing agent in writing that any prior contact by Mrs. Henderson or Evan Henderson is unauthorized. We notify the mortgage company and insurer. We change locks today. We install cameras today. And we instruct Mrs. Henderson that no one enters the home without Ms. Henderson's approval. And then he looked at my mother. If you violate that, you lose your lease. My mother's mouth opened, and then she closed it, because for once she didn't have a move. Evan slumped in his chair. They'll just go to the house. And I said, Not if we make it clear the house is not a prize and you're not a pipeline. And Mr. Calder nodded, Exactly. And then he did the thing I didn't expect. He called the police right there, not with drama, not with theatrics, just with the quiet authority of someone who knows law is leverage too. And he reported the threats, the photos, the timing, the location, and then he requested a patrol pass by the building. My mother started crying, ugly crying, and she kept saying, Richard would have hated this. And I wanted to scream, but instead I said, Richard built a shield because he knew you'd pick Evan over reality. So don't use his name now like a blanket. Uncle Frank stood up and said, I'm going downstairs. And Mr. Calder immediately said, No. And Uncle Frank bristled, I'm not afraid of some punk. And I said, Uncle Frank, this is a 1982. You can't punch a problem like this and call it courage. And he froze, jaw clenched, and then sat back down like he hated that I was right. And then the lobby intercom buzzed and a security voice came through the phone. There's a man outside who left an envelope at the front door and walked away. And Mr. Calder said, Do not touch it, photograph it, and wait for police. And then he looked at Evan. This is what your investment looks like. Evan put his head in his hands and whispered, I didn't mean to. And my mother said, We can sell the house fast, we can pay them. And I snapped, No. And then I forced my voice back down, because paying them doesn't end anything. It teaches them you're profitable. Mr. Calder slid another paper toward Evan. You're going to sign a consent form allowing me to coordinate with a treatment facility and with law enforcement. And you're going to sign a statement acknowledging you have no authority over the Maple Street property. And Evan's eyes flashed. You're stripping me. And I said, No, we're stopping you. He picked up the pen, handshaking, and for a second I thought he'd refuse, and then he signed, and that tiny scribble felt like the first real crack in the old family religion that said the son gets saved at any cost and the daughter gets sacrificed quietly. My mother stared at Evan's signature like she'd never seen it before, and she whispered, "What did I do?" And I almost felt sorry for her, until I remembered the funeral. The way she nodded while my brother announced he'd sell the home. The way she offered me up like a spare tire. And then I thought, consequences don't ask if you're ready. The police arrived, and we heard the elevator doors down the hall open and shut. And then Mr. Calder's assistant came in pale and said, "They're taking the envelope." And Mr. Calder stood, straightened his suit, and said, "Good." And then he looked at me and said, "Miss Henderson, the next few hours decide everything, because if this intimidation doesn't work, they escalate, and the question is, do you let fear steer you, or do you steer faster than fear?" And I nodded, and then my phone buzzed. One more time, because of course it did, and this time the message wasn't a photo. It was a sentence that made my blood go ice cold. "Tell your mom we know where she sleeps." The second I read that message, "Tell your mom we know where she sleeps," I didn't feel brave, I didn't feel righteous. I felt the kind of cold fear that makes your hands go numb while your brain starts speed running worst-case scenarios. And the wild part is my mother didn't even flinch at first, because she still hadn't accepted that this wasn't a family argument anymore. This was a predator circling. And Evan's addiction had left a blood trail right to our front door. And Mr. Calder looked at me and said, "We treat that as a credible threat until proven otherwise." And then he pointed at Evan like he was an exhibit in a courtroom and said, "This is what enabling buys you. Not peace, not love, not keeping the family together. It buys you danger with a schedule." And Evan snapped, "Stop talking about me like I'm not here." And Mr. Calder said, "Then start acting like you are." And the police officer standing near the doorway asked to see the phone, and I handed it over, and he took a photo of my screen with his own device, noted the timestamps, asked if the number was traceable, and then said the sentence that made my mother's face crumble. "Ma'am, do you have anywhere else you can stay tonight?" And my mother blinked like the question offended her. "This is my home." And the officer didn't budge. "I understand, but right now it's a location they believe is leverage, so I need you to answer the question." And my mother's mouth opened, and then it closed, and you could physically see the moment she realized she'd been calling herself a victim while she was actively protecting the person who lit the match. I said, "You're not staying at Maple Street tonight," and she turned on me with this flash of old entitlement. "You can't tell me where I can and can't sleep." And I said, "I can, because you signed a lease, because the house is under my LLC, and because I'm not going to let you get hurt just to prove a point." And then I added, quieter, "And I'm not going to let you use danger as another way to guilt me." Mr. Calder was already moving, making calls like a man putting out fires before anyone smells smoke. He had his assistant contacting a locksmith, a security company, and a property manager, and he told the officer, "We want a patrol pass by the home and an incident number now." And then he looked at me and said, "You're going to set boundaries that feel mean to people who profited from you having none." And I wanted to laugh because, honestly, it was almost funny how quickly my family went. From "Brianna can find another place" to "Brianna, please save us." Like I was a fire extinguisher they only remembered existed once the kitchen was already in flames. Evan kept pacing like a trapped animal, rubbing his palms on his suit pants, and he said, "They're not going to stop because you make police reports." And the officer answered him without even looking up, "They stop when the target stops being useful." And I said, "Exactly." And then I turned to Evan and said, "You're not stepping foot in that house again, not tonight, not tomorrow, not when you get out of rehab, not unless a therapist and a judge sign off that you're not a threat to yourself or anyone else." And my mother tried to protest, "He's my son." And I said, "And I was your daughter, and you still threw me under the bus at Dad's funeral, so don't start playing Mother of the Year now because you're scared." We left the office under escort through a side exit because building security didn't want us walking past the front doors like a little parade of panic. And when I got to the parking garage, my stomach turned because the photo they sent earlier wasn't random. It was angled like someone had been standing behind a pillar, watching, waiting, and I had this ugly thought, this neurotic thought that I'm not proud of, but it was real. What if one of them is already inside the neighborhood? What if they've already stood on that porch? What if they've already looked through the windows of the house where I learned to ride a bike? And that thought made my skin crawl. Mr. Calder handed me a card with a number on it and said, "This is a private security supervisor. You call him before you go to the property, not after." And then he looked at my mother and said, "You will go to your sister's apartment or a hotel arranged through my office, and you will not contact Evan privately, because anything you say can be used to manipulate you." And my mother whispered, "I don't have money for hotels." And I said, "I do, and I hate that I'm saying this, but tonight isn't the night for pride." Evan suddenly stopped pacing and said, "If you pay them, they'll go away." And I said, "If I pay them, they'll come back with friends." And the officer nodded like he'd heard that delusion 1,000 times. And then he said, "We're going to request a restraining order and increase patrols. But ma'am, you need to understand something. These kinds of debts can involve people who don't follow court paperwork." And I watched my mother swallow hard. And for the first time in my life, she looked at me like I was the adult in the room. That night, we didn't go to Maple Street first. We went to a treatment intake center in New Jersey because I told Evan, "If you're scared, good. Let that fear finally do something useful." And the intake counselor looked at him the way you look at someone who's been lying so long they forgot where the truth starts, and she asked him questions that stripped him down. How often? How much? What substances? What triggers? What debt? What threats? And when he tried to soften it, she didn't let him. She said, "You don't get to minimize your way out of danger." And Evan started crying. Not pretty crying, just quiet tears that leaked like his body was finally admitting it couldn't keep pretending to be fine. We dropped him there with a 90-day plan, no phone access, mandatory group therapy, and a financial accountability program. And when he looked at my mother and said, "I'm sorry," she whispered, "I'm sorry too." And I stood there thinking, wow, look at that. The apology arrives right on time, exactly when consequences get loud. We went back to my apartment afterward, and my mother sat on my couch like a stranger, staring at my cheap lamp, my stack of mail, my kitchen table that wobbled if you leaned on it, and she said, "You live like this?" And I said, "Yes, because nobody bought me a safety net." And she didn't argue. She just nodded, and that nod was different than the one at the funeral. This one didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like shame. Around 2 a.m., my phone rang, and my heart jumped because I thought it was another threat, but it was Grandma Ruth, and she said, "Honey, are you awake?" And I said, "I am now." And she whispered, "Your mother called me crying, and I'm going to tell you what I told her. This is what happens when you worship one child and neglect the other." And I laughed, a small, tired laugh, because Grandma Ruth has always had the kind of honesty that makes people furious and then quietly grateful later. Then she said, "Brianna, your father left something else." And my stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" And she said, "He gave me a key and told me if things ever got dangerous, if Evan ever dragged the wrong people around, I was to give it to you." And I sat up straight. "A key to what?" And Grandma Ruth paused like she was choosing her words carefully. "A lockbox, honey, and it isn't about money, it's about proof." And I felt my throat go dry, because suddenly this wasn't just about keeping the house, this was about understanding how long my dad had been quietly watching the storm coming. The next morning, Mr. Calder texted me, "Security installed, cameras live, locks changed, patrol requested," and then he added, "We have a legal window to file an emergency protective motion today. Meet me at 11. And I looked at my mother asleep on my couch, her pearls in her hand like she'd been holding them all night, and I thought, the funny thing about pearls is they're made from irritation. And for the first time I wondered if maybe, deep down, she knew that. I grabbed my coat, and before I walked out, I looked at her and said, "When you wake up, we're going to have a conversation you've avoided for 20 years, and she didn't hear me. But I said it anyway because I needed the universe to know I wasn't going back to silence. And as I stepped into the hallway, my phone buzzed again, not a threat this time, a single text from Evan's intake counselor. He disclosed an additional debt you were not told about, and it changes the risk level. And my chest tightened because if the number was bigger, the people behind it were likely worse, and suddenly Grandma Ruth's lockbox key felt heavier in my pocket, like it had been waiting for this exact moment, and I realized the next move wasn't just legal, it was personal, because whatever my dad hid in that box, it was the kind of thing that could either save us or blow this family wide open. When Grandma Ruth handed me that little brass key, I felt it in my teeth. You know that metallic taste you get when your body decides something is danger before your brain catches up. And I drove to her townhouse like I was late for a fire, hands clenched on the steering wheel, windshield wipers squeaking even though it wasn't raining, because my mind was replaying that one sentence she said, "It isn't about money, it's about proof." And the word proof is a loaded gun in a family like mine. Because proof means someone lied on purpose and then doubled down for years. Grandma Ruth was waiting with her robe tied tight and her hair pinned up like she meant business, and the second I stepped inside, she said, "Before you open anything, I need you to promise me one thing." And I said, "If this is about forgiveness, Grandma, I'm not ready." And she grabbed my hand, looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Promise you won't protect your mother from the truth again. Because the truth is the only thing that can stop this cycle." And that hit me hard because I realized I'd been protecting her without even meaning to, by being quiet, by being polite, by letting her rewrite history like it was a bedtime story, she told herself, so she could sleep at night. The lockbox was in her hall closet behind a stack of old quilts, a black metal box with a combination wheel and a faded sticker that said, Henderson Construction, and when Grandma Ruth slid it out, she whispered, "Your father dropped this off 3 months ago, right after his diagnosis, and he told me, if Evan ever drags trouble to that house, give Brianna the key and call Gerald." And I felt my throat tighten because my dad knew, he saw the pattern, he saw the danger, and he still left this world with people thinking he was just quiet, just passive, just not emotional, when really he'd been planning like a man building storm shutters while everyone else was arguing about curtains. I unlocked it, and inside were 3 things arranged like a message. A manila envelope labeled, "Do not show Linda," a small flash drive on a lanyard, and a folded letter in my father's shaky handwriting with my name on it. And the second I saw my name, I felt that familiar sting behind my eyes, because no matter how old you get, there's something about a parent writing your name like they're reaching for you across time. I didn't open the letter first, I know that sounds backwards, but I had this fear that if I read his words, it would soften me, and I couldn't afford soft right now, not with threats showing up on phones, and my mother sleeping on my couch like a ghost of choices she refused to own. So I opened the envelope, and what slid out made my stomach drop. Photocopies of bank statements, a ledger of transfers, and a stack of emails printed out like evidence. And right on top was a handwritten note from my dad that said, "Brianna, if you're reading this, they're trying to sell the house or save Evan again, and they will try to make you the villain. Don't let them." The emails weren't about family, they were about money, and not just Evan's gambling. There were wires going out under my mother's name, not one time, dozens of times, and the subject lines were always the same bland nonsense like consulting fee or property assessment, but the amounts were ugly, 5 figures here, 20,000 there, and then I saw the name that kept repeating in the recipient line, Sable Ridge Capital, and I didn't know what that was, so I did what any sane person does. When their family turns into a crime documentary, I opened my laptop and searched it, and the results weren't normal. No real website, no reviews, no clean business footprint, just scattered mentions in court dockets and consumer complaint boards, and I felt my blood go cold, because normal companies don't hide like that. Grandma Ruth leaned over my shoulder and said, Your mother called it helping Evan restructure. And I turned to her and said, Grandma, this looks like paying somebody off. And she nodded once, slow, and said, That's why your father didn't tell her. He knew she'd sacrifice anything to keep Evan from facing consequences, even you. Then I plugged in the flash drive, and what popped up was a folder labeled Evan. And inside were screenshots and scanned documents and one audio file named parking lot _Jefferson _2 a.m. And my heart started pounding because that was the night my dad died, and it hit me like a punch. My father recorded something that night, and he kept it, and he hid it, and he knew one day I'd need it. I clicked play, and at first it was just muffled sound, car doors, distant traffic, and then my father's voice, low and strained, saying, Evan, I'm not giving you the house. And then Evan's voice, sharper, desperate, You don't understand. They'll come after me. And my father said, Then you tell the truth. You get help. And Evan snapped. The truth gets people hurt. And then I heard my mother's voice, and it didn't sound like grief. It sounded like calculation. Richard, just do it. It's only paper. And my father said, It's not paper, Linda. It's her life. And then Evan said the sentence that made my skin crawl. Brianna doesn't need it. She's got her little city job. She'll be fine. And my father's voice broke. Stop calling her little. And my mother said, We're not talking about Brianna right now. Like I was an inconvenience. Like I was background noise in my own story. And then my father said, This is exactly why I'm doing it this way. Because you two will burn everything down and call it love. I sat there frozen, listening to my dead father defend me in a way I'd begged for as a teenager. And instead of relief, I felt rage, because he had the words, he had them, he just didn't say them to me when it could have saved me years of feeling invisible. And then I caught myself, because no, he did save me. He saved me the way he knew how, with locks and papers and secret keys and proof, because in a house where feelings were punished, evidence was the only language that survived. Grandma Ruth touched my shoulder and said, Now you understand why he trusted you. And I whispered, I understand why he didn't trust her. And that felt cruel, but it also felt true. On the drive back to my apartment, my phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Calder. The additional debt is not $340,000. It's closer to $610,000, and part of it appears tied to a private lender with aggressive collection practices. And my hands started shaking again, because that meant the threats weren't bluffing, and it also meant my mother's wires to Sable Ridge weren't kindness. They were panic payments. When I got home, my mother was awake, sitting upright on my couch with her pearls wrapped around her fingers like a rosary, and she looked at me and said, Where did you go? And I didn't answer that question. I asked my own, How long have you been paying them? And her face went tight. Paying who? And I said, Don't do that, Mom. Don't play dumb with me today. And she swallowed, eyes darting like she was trying to find an exit. And then she whispered, Since last spring. And I said, So. While Dad was getting tired, while he was sick, while he was still alive, you were moving money out to cover Evan. And she snapped, He's my son. And I said, And I was your daughter, and you still told 40 people I could find another place. And she flinched because she knew that line. She heard it in her head at night, the way you hear your worst moment echo when the room is quiet. I set my laptop on the coffee table, played the audio file, and I watched her face change in real time as she heard her own voice saying, We're not talking about Brianna right now. And she covered her mouth like she wanted to swallow the words back into the past. And then she started crying, not elegant crying, just the messy kind, and she whispered, I didn't know he recorded that. And I said, He recorded it because he didn't trust you. And that landed like a slap, but it was the truth. And we were done with lies. Then I did the thing I never do. I asked a question I was scared of the answer to. Did you ever love me the way you love him? And she stared at me, eyes red, and she said, I loved you, but I didn't understand you. And I laughed, a sharp, ugly laugh, because that's the excuse people use when they refuse to try. And I said, You understood me just fine? You just decided I'd survive neglect better than he'd survive consequences." She went quiet, and then she whispered, "I was raised to believe sons carry the family name, daughters leave." And I said, "And you chose to keep believing that even after it hurt me." And she looked down at the pearls and said, "I don't know how to fix this." And I said, "You don't fix it by asking me for money. You fix it by telling the truth to everyone you lied to, including the relatives you recruited to shame me." And she said, "They'll hate me." And I said, "Good, let them, because I've been the villain in your story for years. It's your turn to sit in the discomfort you handed me." Then my phone rang, and it was Evan's counselor again, and she said, "He disclosed a name, and I'm obligated to advise you to treat it seriously." And she gave me the name, and it matched the same lender name printed on one of the documents from my dad's envelope. And the puzzle snapped into place so fast it made me dizzy. Because this wasn't just Evan gambling. This was a network of predatory money that had been feeding on my family while my mother called it help. And my father tried to quietly barricade the one thing that could keep me safe. I looked at my mother and said, "Today you're going to sit with Mr. Calder and the police, and you're going to tell the full truth, every payment, every call, every threat, because silence is what got us here." And she opened her mouth to argue, and then stopped, like she finally realized I wasn't asking. If you're listening right now, I want you to weigh in, because this is where people always split into two camps. The family is family no matter what camp, and the boundaries or you'll drown camp. So tell me, did my mother cross a line that can't be uncrossed? Or is this the kind of thing you work through if there's real accountability? Because I know what I think, but I want to know what you would do if this was your family and your safety. We drove to Mr. Calder's office an hour later, and when my mother sat down and started talking, something changed. Like confession pulled poison out of her system, and for the first time, she said the word she'd avoided for decades. I favored him. And my stomach clenched because hearing it out loud was both validating and heartbreaking. And she said, "I protected him even when he lied." And I blamed Brianna because it was easier than blaming my parenting. And Mr. Calder didn't comfort her. He just nodded and said, "Good, now we can work with reality." He filed an emergency motion to bar any sale activity, issued a formal no trespass notice for Evan on Maple Street, and initiated a law enforcement report with the lender's name attached. And then he looked at me and said, "You're going to be tempted to soften this, don't? This is the moment your father planned for." And I thought about that key, that lockbox, that audio file, and I realized my dad didn't just leave me a house. He left me a map out of the maze. That night, I stood on the porch of Maple Street for the first time since the funeral, security cameras blinking softly, new locks clicking like a promise, and I held the old key ring with my childhood photo inside, and I whispered, "I hear you now." And I didn't feel rich. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady, like my spine finally matched the life I'd built. And here's the last twist you didn't see coming, because right as I was about to go inside, my phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. And it wasn't a threat, it was a photo. And in the photo was Evan, outside the rehab facility, looking straight at the camera like someone had caught him at the wrong time. And beneath it was one sentence: "He's not where you think he is." And in that moment, I realized the danger wasn't just outside the family anymore. The danger might be inside it. And the next story you need to watch is the one where I explain how we discovered Evan's rehab wasn't rehab at all, and what I did when I realized my own brother might have been playing us from day one. Because if you think a house can reveal betrayal, wait until you see what the truth does to the people who built their whole identity on lies.